Most people assume cowboys ate beef every single night. The logic seems airtight. These were men surrounded by thousands of cattle on every major drive, riding alongside more red meat than most American families would see in a decade. Here is the problem. The cattle on a trail drive belonged to the rancher. Slaughtering one without explicit permission was not a meal. It was a firing offense. Trail bosses kept meticulous tallies of every animal that left Texas and every animal that arrived at the Kansas railheads, and the count at the end had better match the count at the beginning. When fresh beef was actually available, from an injured animal or a rare authorized slaughter, the men who cooked it treated the occasion as an event. Every technique they used was built around one governing principle: extract everything and waste nothing. The medium that made most of these methods possible was tallow. Rendered beef fat, stripped from the thick suet around the kidneys and along the spine, hard and white, and shelf-stable for months without refrigeration. Most people who know cowboy food history know the beans and the biscuits. Almost nobody talks about tallow. That is the oversight this list is here to correct. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten ways cowboys actually cooked beef on the open range. Number 25. Coal direct searing. The simplest method was also the oldest. When time was short and equipment limited, a cowboy laid a thick cut of beef directly onto glowing mesquite coals. Not onto a grate. Directly onto the coals themselves, which at that stage of the burn held a steady radiant heat well above 800 degrees. The exterior charred almost instantly, forming a crust that sealed the surface, while the interior cooked through on residual heat. Cowboys called this the prairie sear. The coal ash that adhered was brushed off before eating. The slight bitterness of the char was not considered a flaw. Trail journals from the 1870s record this method, noting that it required no equipment whatsoever, which mattered on a drive where every pound in the supply wagon had to earn its place. Number 24. The salt box cure. Wooden boxes packed with coarse rock salt traveled on supply wagons across every major trail route. When an animal was slaughtered, cuts that could not be cooked immediately were buried in the salt within hours of butchering. The salt pulled moisture from the meat through osmotic pressure, creating a brine that inhibited bacterial growth and held the cut stable for weeks. A 50-pound bag of rock salt cost roughly 30 cents at frontier trading posts in the 1870s. The resulting salt beef was dense, dark, and intensely flavored. Most cooks soaked salt box cuts in fresh water for 12 to 24 hours before cooking, drawing the excess sodium back out and leaving a piece of meat fundamentally transformed, tougher than fresh beef, deeper in color, more concentrated in flavor. Number 23. The green stick spit. When the chuckwagon was miles behind and a cowboy on patrol had beef but no cast iron, he improvised. A straight green branch cut from a cottonwood or willow was sharpened at one end and threaded through a piece of beef. Green wood was the specific requirement. Dry wood would catch fire and deposit ash onto the meat. Green wood stayed cool enough at the handhold to remain without igniting. The spit rested across two forked sticks driven into the ground at either side of the fire. The technique appears in frontier accounts going back to the 1840s, borrowed from indigenous cooking methods that Anglo-cowboys encountered and adopted without ceremony. The result was uneven by any modern standard, charred in spots and underdone in others, but hot. On the open range, hot was most of the work. Number 22. The flat rock plancha. Flat sandstone and granite slabs were common across southwestern trail routes. Experienced chuckwagon cooks learned to identify rocks with smooth, dense surfaces free of water inclusions that could crack violently when heated. The right rock, positioned at the edge of a fire, and allowed to heat slowly for 45 minutes, reached a surface temperature high enough to sear beef cleanly. Thin cuts sliced from the flank or inner thigh went onto the heated surface and cooked in minutes. The method was borrowed almost entirely from vaquero tradition, and before that, from indigenous peoples of the Southwest who had used heated stone for centuries. No fat was required because the stone surface at sufficient temperature does not bond with protein the way cold metal does. Number 21. Ash pit roasting. For large cuts needing hours of steady heat without attendance, the ash pit was the answer. Cooks burned a fire down to deep coals over 2 to 3 hours of steady burning. Dense mesquite produced a bed covered by thick white ash that held heat steadily for 4 to 6 hours afterward. A beef roast from the round or shoulder was wrapped tightly in wet burlap, or in the broad outer pads of prickly pear cactus, both found along Texas and New Mexico trail routes. The wrapped roast was buried in the ash bed and covered completely. The cook left it unattended through the afternoon while the drive moved, returning when the crew stopped for the night. Collagen in the connective tissue had hours to convert to gelatin. A skilled chuckwagon cook who had mastered the ash pit produced beef, so yielding it separated at the press of a thumb. Number 20. Coffee-cured jerky. Strips of beef, cut thin against the grain, were rubbed with a mixture of coarse salt and spent coffee grounds, then hung to dry in the sun or over very low smoke. The coffee served two purposes. The natural oils in roasted coffee grounds acted as a mild antimicrobial agent that supplemented the preservative work of the salt. The tannic acids in the grounds partially broke down the surface proteins of the beef and created a papery crust during drying that held interior moisture through the first days on the trail, extending the window during which the jerky was pleasantly chewy rather than hard as iron. Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee, which dominated the frontier market so completely that cowboys used the word Arbuckles as a generic name for any coffee at all, provided the raw material. Spent grounds already brewed once were used rather than fresh, a practical economy that produced the same result for nothing additional. First pattern break. Here is where the history of beef on the trail gets complicated in a way the Western movies never acknowledge. The chuckwagon cook was not just a cook. He was the most technically skilled person on a trail drive, and almost certainly the most knowledgeable about beef. Trail bosses who could not afford a bad cook paid for it in low morale, poor performance, and men who were hungry and unhappy and showed it in their work. The cook who knew how to stretch an animal across a week of meals, who understood which cuts needed acid and which needed fat, and which needed nothing but time and low heat, was worth more to an outfit than any single cowboy riding beside the herd. The irony is that most of these cooks were anonymous. Their names were not recorded. Their techniques were not documented. What they knew traveled person to person, demonstrated in the early morning dark before the drive moved out. It is only in oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s and in the private journals of trail bosses preserved in Texas and Kansas archives that any of this becomes recoverable at all. The cooking that fed the American cattle industry was preserved the same way the beef was preserved, salted down and hoped to hold together long enough to pass on. Number 19. Vinegar tenderizing. Cuts from the working muscles of a longhorn steer were tough in a way that modern commercial beef, grain-fed and aged in temperature-controlled rooms, is not. Longhorns walked thousands of miles before slaughter. Their muscles were dense, and their connective tissue was packed tightly enough that a fast cook would produce meat nearly impossible to chew. Vaquero cooks addressed this before heat was ever applied. A bath of apple cider vinegar and water, sometimes with wild onion or dried chili pepper, was used to soak tough cuts for 12 to 24 hours before cooking. The acetic acid in the vinegar partially denatures the protein chains in connective tissue, giving collagen a head start on the breakdown that heat would eventually complete. Apple cider vinegar cost about 20 cents per gallon at frontier trading posts in the 1880s. Chuckwagon cooks bought it alongside the salt and thought nothing of it. Number 18. Tallow poached tough cuts. For the toughest cuts, the brisket, the shank, the neck, tallow poaching submerged the beef completely in rendered fat, heated to between 220 degrees Fahrenheit and 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and held there for 3 to 4 hours. The fat acted as both the cooking medium and the seal. Moisture inside the cut could not escape into the surrounding liquid, because fat and water do not mix, meaning the beef cooked in its own internal moisture rather than losing it to the environment. What emerged from a tallow poach was a cut transformed from something nearly inedible into something gelatinous, yielding, and deeply flavored. Cowboys called the resulting liquid cooking grease and used it to fry everything else for the next 2 days. The tallow that went in was richer than the tallow that started. Nothing was wasted. Number 17. Dutch oven brisket. If there was a single piece of equipment that defined beef cookery on the open range, it was the 14-inch cast-iron Dutch oven. The combination of cast-iron mass, a tight-fitting lid, and the practice of burying the oven in coals, with additional coals placed on the lid, created a cooking environment that maintained even heat in a way no open fire could match. Brisket, one of the toughest cuts on the animal, required 12 to 14 hours in a modern smoker to reach the collagen breakdown temperature that produces a yielding texture. In a Dutch oven buried in hardwood coals, that same result arrived in 6 to 8 hours. The brisket braised in its own collagen-rich liquid, which had converted to gelatin by the time the lid was removed. Surrounding the beef, in a thick, naturally thickened sauce, no flour or starch had touched. Cowboys who ate Dutch oven brisket described it in trail journals with a consistency that suggests it was the meal they looked forward to most. Number 16. Marrow bone broth. When a steer was slaughtered on the trail, the large leg bones were set aside. Experienced cooks cracked them with a hatchet to expose the yellow-red marrow inside and dropped them into the largest pot on the chuckwagon with cold water and a splash of vinegar. The pot simmered for anywhere from 6 to 24 hours. The result was a liquid so rich with dissolved collagen, fat, and minerals that it set into a firm jelly when cooled. Cowboys who had been sick from bad water or exhausted beyond what sleep would fix were fed marrow broth before anything else. The vinegar was not for flavor. Experienced cooks had learned, without knowing the chemistry, that acid added to the simmering water drew minerals from the bones that plain water did not, specifically calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, which dissolve in ionic form when acetic acid is present. What we now sell in glass jars at specialty stores for $8 a quart was standard treatment for an unwell cowboy on the Chisholm Trail in 1873. Number 15. Son of a gun stew. There was no celebration on the open range quite like a fresh slaughter, and no preparation that honored it like son of a gun stew, known by a considerably saltier name around actual campfires. Every edible part of the steer, not going to be preserved by other means, went into this pot. The heart, the liver, the sweetbreads, the tongue, the kidneys, and the marrow gut, the tube connecting the two stomachs of a young calf, which releases a creamy, almost sweet substance into the broth that no other ingredient can replicate. These went in together with wild onions, dried chili peppers, and garlic, simmered low for 2 to 3 hours until the organ meats had given everything they had to the liquid. Trail diaries from the Goodnight Loving route describe son of a gun stew as the one dish that made cowboys stop complaining about everything else. Second pattern break. Here is what modern nutrition science has confirmed about the cooking approach that chuckwagon tradition developed by necessity. Tallow, the rendered beef fat that served as the primary cooking medium on the open range, is composed predominantly of oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fatty acid found in olive oil, alongside palmitic and stearic acid. Research published in the Journal of Lipid Research and in nutritional biochemistry literature over the past 20 years has consistently found that stearic acid, unlike other saturated fats, does not raise LDL cholesterol levels and may be neutral or modestly beneficial in cardiovascular terms. The cowboy who cooked in tallow because it was shelf-stable and available from an animal he had just slaughtered was not making a health choice. He was making a practical one. That the practical choice turned out to be nutritionally defensible is the kind of detail quietly omitted in the story of how modern food culture moved away from animal fats toward refined vegetable oils. The organ meats in Son of a Gun stew delivered concentrated doses of vitamin A and B12, along with iron and zinc, nutrients that kept men healthy through physical labor that would destroy most modern bodies in 3 days. The instinct to eat the whole animal was not just economical, it was biologically sound. Researchers studying traditional diets now confirm that nose-to-tail eating provided nutritional completeness that muscle meat alone cannot match. Cowboys on the Chisholm Trail knew none of this. They knew it because wasting food was unthinkable, and because the men who ate well worked harder and lasted longer. Those two facts were enough. Number 14. Smoked beef tongue. A tongue from a full-grown steer weighed 3 to 4 pounds and contained almost no connective tissue in the conventional sense, being composed of dense muscle fiber that responded to heat differently than any other cut. Cowboys who knew what they were doing began preparing a tongue by brining it overnight in a mixture of salt, water, and dried chili pepper. The next morning, the brined tongue went into low smoke, fed by mesquite chips or dried buffalo chips for 4 to 6 hours. The tongue emerged firm on the exterior, its outer skin peeling away cleanly to reveal dense, finely grained meat beneath. Thin-sliced and laid across a piece of sourdough biscuit, it was the closest thing to a proper sandwich that the trail offered. Trail boss accounts mentioned tongue preparation specifically as something cooks were evaluated on, suggesting the skill was not universal, and that cooks who had it were known for it. Number 13. Beef liver in tallow. Liver from a freshly slaughtered steer was cooked the same day, always. A cast iron skillet went over the hottest part of the fire with a spoonful of tallow melted in it. Slices of liver, cut a half-inch thick, went in when the fat was smoking. 2 minutes on the first side, 2 minutes on the second. No more than that, ever. The mistake that gave a generation of American children a lifelong hatred of liver was overcooking, which drives out moisture and produces bitter, chalky compounds from the high iron content. Done correctly in tallow at high heat, for exactly the right time, beef liver has a mild, almost sweet flavor, and a texture nothing like the leathery horror most people associate with the name. Sliced onions caramelized in the same tallow before the liver went in were laid back over the top when the liver came out. This was considered by most trail crews the best part of a slaughter day. Number 12. Red-eye beef drippings. When beef had been seared or fried in a cast iron skillet and the drippings remained in the pan alongside the caramelized fond, the cook poured strong black coffee directly into the hot pan and scraped. The liquid bubbled violently, lifting the fond from the surface and incorporating it into a thin, dark, intensely savory and slightly bitter sauce that went over the seared beef, over biscuits, or into the bean pot. The tannins in the coffee interacted with the fat in the drippings to produce a flavor greater than either component alone. Cowboys called this redaye. It required nothing that was not already in the pan. A cook who discarded his drippings was a cook who had not been cooking long enough. Number 11, pemmican. Lean beef was dried until brittle, then pounded to a coarse powder with a smooth stone. While still warm, that powder was mixed with an equal weight of melted tallow. The mixture was packed dense into rawhide bags and left to cool and solidify. The result was shelf-stable for months, calorie-dense in a way nothing else on the trail matched, and it required no preparation to consume. A piece the size of a fist contained enough fat and protein to sustain a man through a full day of hard physical labor. The word is Cree, borrowed from Plains nations who had refined the recipe to include dried chokecherries and service berries, which added carbohydrate and vitamin C. Cowboys who adopted pemmican usually left out the berries, a simplification that reduced nutritional completeness but kept everything that made it practically essential. Number 10. Stuffed beef heart. The heart of a full-grown steer was 3 to 4 pounds of pure muscle with almost no connective tissue and almost no fat, dense and mild, and capable of absorbing flavor from whatever it was packed with. Chuckwagon cooks who had the thyme-stuffed beef hearts with a mixture of dried onion, salt, chili pepper, and cornbread crumbs left from the previous meal. The stuffed heart was brined overnight in salt water, which firmed the muscle and seasoned it through to the center, and braised in the Dutch oven the next day for 4 hours. The resulting cut carved clean and thin, each slice carrying a ring of dark muscle around a herb-packed center. Cowboys who had never eaten heart before, a trail drive ate it afterward by preference. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was simply the best thing available when the cook took the time to do it properly. Number 9. Slow-boiled beef with pot liquor. For cuts too tough for the Dutch oven, the long boil was the answer. A piece of chuck or neck roast went into the largest pot with cold water to cover, a cut onion, salt, and nothing else. The fire was built low, and the pot was left at a bare simmer for 3 to 4 hours. What this produced was both a cooked piece of beef and the pot liquor, the richly flavored cooking broth that the cook called not a byproduct, but a base. The beef came out tender enough to pull apart with 2 forks. The pot liquor went over the beans, into the biscuit dough if it needed moisture, into the marrow broth if that was simmering alongside. A skilled chuckwagon cook ran multiple pots with overlapping purposes. The pot liquor, from a slow-boiled roast, was never poured out. It was the base of everything that came after. Third pattern break. Here is something the culinary world of the past 40 years has done quietly and without full acknowledgement. Every preparation on this list that involves tallow, organ meats, bone broth, slow collagen breakdown, and whole animal cooking has been independently rediscovered by some segment of the culinary and nutritional world and repackaged as either artisanal innovation or ancestral health practice. Bone broth appeared on restaurant menus around 2014 as though someone had invented it. Nose-to-tail cooking became a celebrated restaurant movement in the early 2000s, associated with chefs in London and New York who were publicly praised for doing what every ranch cook on the American frontier was doing as a matter of basic economics in 1870. Tallow appeared as a premium cooking fat in specialty stores about 10 years ago, sold at prices that would have confused a man who rendered his own from freshly slaughtered suet as a matter of course. None of this is a criticism of the people practicing these things today. The methods are sound, the nutrition is real. But there is something worth sitting with in the fact that the men who built the American cattle industry were practicing all of it simultaneously, not as a philosophy, not as a movement, not as a brand, but because the alternative was wasting what they had and sending their crew to bed with nothing. Number 8. Mesquite bark smoking. Mesquite wood was the universal fuel of the Texas ranges, abundant, dense, and hot-burning. Chuckwagon cooks who had grown up in Texas knew that green mesquite wood, when added to a coal fire rather than used as primary fuel, produced a smoke that was aromatic and slightly sweet, carrying volatile organic compounds that adhered to the surface of beef during slow cooking, and produced the flavor profile eventually codified as Texas barbecue. The practice of adding mesquite chips to a coal bed specifically for the smoke appears in the accounts of trail cooks going back to the 1860s. Modern barbecue culture discovered this principle as though it were a 20th century invention. It was a 19th century trail cook's technique practiced by men who never named it anything. Number 7. The branding iron sear. During spring roundup, when cattle were branded, the branding irons were heated in a dedicated fire until they reached temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Between brandings, when the iron was hot and the cook had a piece of beef that needed to be started quickly, a sear directly from the branding iron onto a thick-cut piece of beef produced a result no other method on the open range matched. The extreme heat applied for 3 to 5 seconds per side triggered the Maillard reaction at a depth and intensity that standard cast iron cooking at 400 degrees never achieved. Modern steakhouses advertising extreme heat cooking using infrared broilers engineered to reach 1,500 degrees are attempting to replicate what a cowboy stumbled into by accident during branding season and immediately recognized as something worth doing again. Number 6. Tallow-basted spit roast. When time allowed, which was rare on a working drive, but more common during winter layover at a ranch base, chuckwagon cooks set up a full spit over a long trench fire, burned down to coals over 2 hours. A bone-in roast from the hip or shoulder was threaded on an iron rod, supported at either end by forked posts, and rotated every 10 to 15 minutes through a 4 to 6 hour cook. The basting was the element that separated a good spit roast from a dry one. Tallow, melted in a small pot beside the fire, was applied to the rotating surface every 15 minutes, building a continuous coating that prevented the exterior from drying out. The tallow baste also picked up drippings falling from the roast, creating a continuously enriched basting liquid that carried the flavor of the beef back onto its own surface with each application. This was the closest thing to festive cooking the open range produced. Number 5. Slow-braised chuck in vinegar and bone broth. This preparation combined nearly every technique on this list into a single pot, and represented the pinnacle of what an experienced trail cook could produce from a tough animal on a long drive. A chuck roast, seared first in tallow at the highest heat the fire would allow, went into the Dutch oven alongside a cup of apple cider vinegar, whatever remained of the morning's marrow broth, a sliced wild onion, and a dried chili pepper. The lid was sealed, and the oven was buried in coals for 8 hours. The collagen had converted entirely to gelatin. The vinegar had worked through every fiber of the meat during the long braise. The marrow broth had given the braising liquid a body that reduced to a sauce without any additional thickening. The acidity, the fat, the slow heat, and the time had done together what none of them could have done alone. This was the dish that trail bosses requested by name when they had reason to be grateful to their crew. It has no famous name. It existed only in the knowledge of the cook who knew how to make it. Number 4. Blood pudding from the slaughter. On slaughter day, the blood from a freshly killed steer was collected and used before it could fully coagulate. It was mixed with cornmeal, salt, rendered tallow, and dried chili pepper, then poured into intestinal casings, rinsed clean. The mixture was tied off in lengths and dropped into boiling water for 30 to 40 minutes, until the casing firmed and the interior set to a sliceable consistency. The result bore a close resemblance to the blood sausages of European tradition. That makes sense because the technique was documented in German and Czech immigrant communities in Texas, and those communities contributed significantly to cowboy cooking culture. A pound of beef blood produced enough pudding to serve 4 men alongside the beans. It cost nothing because it came from an animal being processed regardless. Wasting it was not considered an option. Number 3. The cold camp meal. On nights when a fire would attract unwanted attention from cattle thieves or rival outfits competing for the same water source, the cook served without fire. Cold jerky, cold salt box beef, soaked but uncooked. Cold marrow bone broth from the morning that had gelled solid in its container, eaten in pieces with a spoon. Cold slices of smoked tongue from the day before. These were not meals anyone looked forward to. They were the proof that the preparations made on days when fire was available were worth making with full care and attention, because the quality of cold food was entirely determined by the quality of the cooking done when conditions allowed. A trail cook who had been careless during the good days sat in the dark with nothing worth eating. A cook who had been careful ate well even on cold camp nights. Number 2. Marrow bone roasted in coals. Whole leg bones were split lengthwise with a hatchet and placed cut side up at the edge of a coal fire for 15 to 20 minutes. This produced one of the most concentrated and accessible forms of nutrition on the open range. The marrow inside the bone cavity, a mixture of fat and bone marrow cells rich in omega fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins, liquefied during the roasting and was scooped out with a thin stick or a knife tip and spread directly onto bread or eaten plain. The flavor was rich, slightly sweet, and deeply savory in a way that no other part of the animal replicated. Plains nations had been roasting marrow bones over open fires for centuries before the first trail drive left Texas, and experienced cowboys who had spent time near those communities adopted the practice because the evidence of what it produced was visible. Men who ate it consistently did not get the bone and joint problems that showed up in men who subsisted only on lean meat and beans. Number 1. The whole animal obligation. At the top of this list is not a single technique. It is the governing principle that made every other method necessary and meaningful. On the open range, when beef was available, wasting any part of it was not a philosophical failure. It was a practical one with real consequences for real men who depended on the nutritional density of every part of that animal to sustain physical labor across conditions that would end most modern people in 3 days. Chuckwagon cooks who understood this principle rendered every scrap of fat into tallow that cooked the next month's meals. They cracked every leg bone for marrow. They brined the tough cuts, dried the lean cuts, stuffed the heart, smoked the tongue, made pudding from the blood, and turned the pot liquor from every long boil into the base of the next preparation. Nothing left the work area unused when a good cook was managing it. Tallow was the thread running through all of it, not as a flavor, not as a nutritional choice in the modern sense. It was the medium that made everything else possible. The stable fat that could withstand high heat without breaking down. Preserve meat without refrigeration. Waterproof leather. Lubricate metal and seal wood against the weather. The cowboy who understood tallow did not call it a health food. He called it what it was, the most useful thing that came out of the animal besides the meat itself. Try rendering your own tallow this week. buy the kidney fat from a butcher for almost nothing. Melt it slowly over the lowest heat your stove can manage. Let it set hard and white. Cook a piece of beef in it. It will taste different. It will taste like something that was always supposed to be used this way and simply got separated from you by about 150 years of convenience. If your family ever worked cattle or kept beef on the table through hard years, drop their name in the comments. I want to know whose hands this knowledge passed through before it reached yours.